Hello, everyone. Welcome to T Chang International 3rd edition 2023.
Hello, everyone.
Today's MC is T Chang from Singapore.
Hi, hello, everyone. I'm Chilling, so I will be the MC for today. So I'll first do a bit introduction of myself. I will talk a little bit about Singapore and the Singapore startup ecosystem before I actually will introduce Mr. David Ng. So for me, my name is Chuling. I'm currently a Nagoya University student. I'm from School of Economics. I'm currently in the 4th year. Next slide, please. So let me introduce to you where is Singapore. So Singapore has this nickname. It's usually called a little red dot. So you can see on the map, like it's very hard for you to see Singapore actually. So there's pros and cons about Singapore. The not so nice thing about Singapore is, the country is too small. So what happens is we don't have natural resources. But there is also a strength comes from being a small country because it's very small. So it's actually very easy for the government to manage. So in a sense, because we don't have natural resources, the biggest thing that we really want to invest in Singapore is what we call the human capital. To put it simply, it's just people. So let me introduce to you what Singapore is about. So these are the data from the Singapore government statistics website based in last year, June 22. So the population of Singapore at the moment is 5.6 million. So just to give a comparison, Nagoya City has 9.6 million. So actually Nagoya City has a lot more people than Singapore. Which I'm also very surprised. Based on the composition, citizens and permanent residents, they're about 4 million. And about 1.6 million are foreign national, which means in terms of percentage, about 28% of the people in Singapore are actually foreigners. So to give a comparison again to Japan. So in Japan, we have 3 million, is double the size of Singapore foreigners. But in terms of the whole populations, Japan foreigners is only consists about 2 to 3%. The main language spoken in Singapore is actually English. But we are considered a multicultural society. So we also speak other types of languages such as Chinese, Malay, and Tamil. Like for me at home, I don't speak English at all. I just speak Chinese language. So actually we are considered a non-traditional native English speaker. So for example, the traditional native English speakers are places like the US, the UK, Australia, and Canada. So for us in Singapore, I think there's a strength when it comes to for us applying to like overseas universities. We don't usually need to take the English test like the TOEFL or ELSA. So it was pretty easy for us. In terms of ethnicity group, about the majority of the ethnicity in Singapore is about 74.1% is Chinese, 13.6% are Malay, 9% are Indian, and 3.3% are other type of ethnicity. Next slide, please. So let me share with you about the Singapore startup ecosystem ranking. So this is the ranking at the moment, in 2023, so Singapore has currently raised up to within the top 8. But before the past few years, we have been around the top 20. So I think recently Singapore has really been becoming a lot more attractive places for the startup companies. Next slide, please. So these are the types of ranking. So this is a ranking called the Doing Business to 2022. So this is the data that is based on the World Bank. At the moment, Singapore is the second easiest place to set up business here because the Singapore government has always wanted to make Singapore a very attractive place to set up business. So we want to set our corporate tax as low as possible. This is another thing about finance, which is called GFCI. GFCI stands for Global Financial Center. We are the top in Asia, so we currently rank the third global financial center. So I think if you're somebody who is interested to work in the finance sector or to study finance actually in Singapore, we are a very attractive places as well. In terms of taxes, the corporate tax, so which is either whether you're a local company or you're a foreign company, we pay the same taxes, which is 70%. Personal taxes, it depends. If you're a resident, usually if you don't earn a certain income cap, you may not be need to pay income tax. But the maximum that you get to pay is 32%. For foreigners, it's usually about ranging from 50% to 22%. So the Singapore government has really trying to promote entrepreneurship. So they actually even set up this thing called the Startup SG. So SG usually stands for Singapore as well. So this is really from a Singapore government website. So they really want to kickstart the Singapore startup ecosystem. So they have a lot of subsidies to already promote to encourage more investors to invest in startup. At the same time, they also encourage more people who are interested to do a startup to actually try in this field. So right now I will be introducing Mr. David Ng. So Mr. David Ng is a he set up a portal company. So this is a liquidation marketplace that is actually committed to reduce global business wastes by connecting sellers of excess inventory with box buyers using currently AI, which is a very hot topic, to determine a fair market prices. So manufacturers of packaged goods, they will actually usually benefit from such a pricing and accessibility methods to find the best liquidation outcome that will be reducing the usable products from being disposable into a landfill. So David is a two-time founder of the venture capital backup B2B. So B2B is a business-to-business tech startups in Asia. So before setting up Poland, he was actually focused on managing international business development for IT service provider in China. Actually went to IPO. So he's originally from Singapore, and he grew up and actually graduated from UC Beverly, along with a law degree from Southwestern Law School in California. So right now, let us welcome Mr. David to speak about his company and the startup ecosystem in Southeast Asia. So thank you very much. So goes to you.
And a bunch of questions.
Yeah. So about the questions, audience, you can actually ask question anytime. So you can actually type the comment into the chat group, and then anytime we can just answer your question. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Ohayou gozaimasu. So today, what I thought would be helpful for the audience is I'll quickly introduce myself, and then I'll explain a little bit about how to navigate either raising funding for a potential startup you might want to do in Singapore or Southeast Asia, or if you're looking to invest in startups, what are the best ways to find startups? So before we get into that topic, though, let me quickly give you some background about who I am, how I came to Singapore, and what I'm currently working on. So although I was born in Singapore, I was raised in California, went to UC Berkeley. And because I was from the Bay Area, I got to meet many influential people, some like Jason Citron, who is now quite well known as the CEO of Discord, was one of my advisors and early mentors. And with the help of Jason, eventually I was able to launch and get funded my first startup, which was a company called Gimme. And this company in 2014, we established in Singapore. And therefore, over the last almost 10 years now, I've seen an evolution from when I first was doing this company to the current company, Pollen, which I'll now just quickly introduce. And then I'll kind of explain the evolution of the Singapore ecosystem over the last 10 years since I started that company. So let's talk a little bit about what I'm doing, because as earlier mentioned, AI is a hot topic. So there are certainly other opportunities to do in Singapore and Southeast Asia, but AI is probably one of the better ones right now. So our idea with this company, Pollen, was that we wanted to figure out how to sell inventory that was about to be thrown away from manufacturing companies. And we got this idea because we had some previous experience with liquidation, and also from that company I just mentioned, Gimme, who I had co-founded with my current co-founder, Liana. Mike joined us later, who was previously doing liquidation for Levi's, and we have a regional team throughout Asia, and we also have some people in Japan who are supporting us also. So thinking about startups, it's important to think about the stage and the journey, and Pollen has definitely been a process. And it's been an opportunity to really discover what are the key business drivers. And I think in generally speaking for all startups, it's a similar type of process where you have one idea and then maybe that evolves over time. So for us, the initial idea was to work with retailers, and then eventually that evolved into brands and now currently AI. But it wasn't overnight, as you can see. This took a few years. And the other thing, I think, to set the stage before talking about the Singapore ecosystem is to think about the timing and why now. Singapore is at a very interesting position. due to the fact that the largest VC markets and startup markets in the world, China and the US, are quite saturated. And therefore, investors are always looking for new opportunities with growth. And what this slide is showing is that for our industry, one of the best times to do our business, which is liquidation, is when you have a lot of excess inventory. And there's never been more excess inventory because of the war and previously the pandemic. So you really have to pick the right time when you're thinking about entering a market. And then you have to pick about what problem that you want to solve. So there's many problems with liquidation. But for us, because we knew we wanted to focus on AI, we focused on the problem around how do you actually intelligently set a price and how do you intelligently match inventory to the right buyer? Because these are things that historically manufacturing companies struggled with. So phrasing your problem when you're thinking about doing a startup, whether it's in Singapore, Japan, or anywhere else, is very important. Therefore, once you have your problem chosen, you can then figure out on the right solution, which for us was a way to use AI to determine and predict what would be the fair market value for some inventory that maybe isn't priced the same in different countries. So for instance, a bottle of Dove shampoo, if it has, let's say, 3 years to use, is probably going to be very similarly priced anywhere around the world. But it's same as you take that bottle of shampoo and it only has, let's say, 3 months to use, different markets in the world may value that bottle of shampoo very differently. So we determined a way to help a manufacturing company predict what would be a fair trading price when they're looking to export that shampoo, meaning selling it from one country to another. So the other thing, just skipping now before I go to the ecosystem, is really to give you an understanding of the investor community. So for Pollen, because we've already been in business for a few years, we've gone through a few rounds of funding. And to set the stage for what I'm going to present next, it's important to understand the different types of investors. How do you find investors and how do you know how much money you need? And why is Singapore a good place to potentially raise money? What we have found works well for us historically is that we work with a combination of what are called family offices, VCs, angels, which are individuals, and angel syndicates, which I'll be explaining more later. So enough about Pollen. Let's talk a little bit now more about Singapore. So, sorry, let me switch here. So back in 2014, when I was leaving the US to enter Singapore and raise the funding for that company called Gimme, one of the things that I wanted to learn about was who are all the investors in Singapore? How do I reach these investors? Who are potential competitors to my business? And maybe how do I find talent to hire? So in the US, the site that I had relied upon to answer those questions typically was either TechCrunch or AngelList. And in Singapore at that time in 2014, there were only a couple options to find a similar type website. So one of those websites that was recommended to me was a website called E27, which still exists 10 years later. And what you can do on E27 is you can do a few things. Number one, you can look to network with other startups. You can look to hire, you can compare the region. So it's not just Singapore, it's also all of Southeast Asia. But more importantly, if you were like me in 2014 and trying to find people to meet, you can look and find who would be potential investors. And as we talked about, there are different groupings of investors, which I'll now go into more detail in a minute, but they break it down here. So for instance, if we wanted to see about, let's say, venture capital, you'll find there's over 1,000 here, right? Which might seem overwhelming, but it's actually not overwhelming when you know what type of stage and what type of investment you need to raise. Very quickly, you can narrow it down and find the right type of investor. But one of the major advantages that you'll find in Singapore versus maybe other markets in Asia is that this 10-year kind of growth has really evolved into what we call multiple stages. So here is what they're referring to stages. You can see there's something called pre-seed, there's something called seed, there's a pre-series A, If we look at some others, you'll see this is Series A, this is Series B. So what do we mean by these stages? Typically, a stage in the journey of a startup is really thinking about from an idea to when you have some type of product, to when you're able to then generate revenue for the product, to then where you're able to scale and make a lot more revenue from the product, right? And it really depends on what your industry is. If you're a B2C, that means business to consumer, like e-commerce, and you're selling products online, then you'll have a certain set of metrics that will guide you and let you know which one of those stages you're at. If you are in our area, which is B2B or business to business, it's a completely different set of metrics. And you'll also find that these type of VCs invest in different categories, and some tend to be more B2C, or you can see this example is B2B. So these are all kind of signals to really narrow the field so it doesn't become overwhelming. But I always recommend that the best place to get started is to look at the local media. So the oldest local media in Singapore, in addition to E27, the next one would be Tech in Asia. And then there are other competitors to those two. So once you get familiar and you start reviewing maybe who are some of the top startups, who are doing ideas maybe similar to your idea, the next thing that you want to think about is, okay, now that I have identified what I want to do, I have an initial idea. How do I get started if I'm a single person and I don't know how to code and I don't have a co-founder? This is usually a typical situation. I myself, I'm not a coder. So I would need to get a co-founder or someone who knows how to code if I wanted to build one of these startups. So how do I do that? So one of the advantages in Singapore is that they are now, and this didn't exist 10 years ago, there are companies and funds that exist to basically do matchmaking for people like you who have an idea, but maybe don't have a co-founder. And so there are a few of these. One of the more famous ones in Singapore is called Antler. So what Antler does is Antler allows for you to join their program. It's almost like a mini MBA. And you get assigned courses. You get assigned mentors who are other founders, investors. But most importantly, you meet your fellow peers in your community. And one of the advantages of that is that through this process, you actually get to meet a potential co-founder. And so why is that really important? It's because it's very, very difficult to do a startup. It is dramatically harder to do a startup if you're doing it as the solo founder, it's called, or meaning you're doing this idea by yourself. If you want to increase the probability of success, and this is just not just for Singapore, but globally, it is always easier to have someone you trust to go along this journey with you together. And so programs like Antler would be a great resource for anyone. And then again, one of the benefits of being in Singapore is that you have these type of programs. So let's say you're one step more advanced, or maybe you already have a team. What would be the next best place to get started in Singapore if you don't need to find a co-founder? Typically, in that case, what we would recommend is then maybe if you already have a team, you have some prototype. One of the best ways then would be to raise what's called angel funding, right? So what do we mean by angel funding? It means really going to individuals and asking them to invest in your company when you have an idea. This is often sometimes called pre-seed. Although pre-seed now is becoming closer to seed, which I'll explain later. So let's just assume that these are individuals. And when you're dealing with individuals, there are two ways to approach them. The first way is really straightforward. You could go back to E27, or you can go to LinkedIn and you could say, oh, this person looks really interesting. It says that they're an angel investor. Let me try to contact them, send them my information, give them my deck, do a pitch, and maybe they'll invest in my company. So if you're going down that path, what would you expect and how does that work in Singapore? And we have raised angel investment. Typically, the best way to go about that is you want to work with someone you really know. So this might be a former colleague. It might be someone you have met professionally. It could even be literally a friend or family member. That's why often this round is called friends and family, or F&F. And in Singapore, a lot of these angel investors typically come in two different types. One is going to be someone who is what we call an operator. An operator would be someone like myself, who maybe is also looking to invest while running their own business. And because they have already done a startup, they're very easy to speak to, and they're a very great resource if you can get them to invest in your company. The other type of angel investor we see very common in Singapore is what we call a financial investor. A financial investor might be someone who worked at Goldman Sachs, they worked at a bank, they're very savvy financially. They can help you in terms of putting together your P&L and your financial statements, but they might not necessarily be the best resource to advise you on the day-to-day operations of running your business. So again, it really depends on your background, but you should probably also determine, are you looking for a financial angel or you're looking for an operator? What about if you want both? Well, if you want both, that's why you have syndicates like Ascend Angels, who my current company, Pollen, works with. And one of the things that you get from Ascend Angels is basically you get a grouping of both financial investors and operators, people who have worked and done a lot of successful businesses together and who have pooled their money together almost like a VC, but they still make independent decisions of what companies they want to invest in. So if you wanted to go down this path, you're looking at probably raising anywhere from maybe $50,000 to around $250,000, right? And that's typically enough to start your venture, at least in Singapore. You can usually hire your initial engineers, you can get started, and you can get what's called typically an MVP or minimum viable product. So that's usually a good starting point. And the good news for you now joining today, this didn't exist 10 years ago. Ascend Angels wasn't here, Antler wasn't here. The next company also wasn't here, which is Iterative. So some of you who maybe are more familiar with startups or maybe you're looking to invest again, you might have heard of a company called YC or YC Combinator. It is an American incubator and is widely recognized as the most successful, most famous of what we call incubators. So 10 years ago, Singapore didn't have any of these incubators, but now there are several. One of the ones that we're familiar with is called Iterative. And their model is very similar to YC. So they invest around $500,000 and they take an equity position in your company. Typically, it's around 10%. And what they do is they invest in what's called cohorts or batches. So usually every quarter, every 3 or 4 months, they will invite companies to apply. You can see the button here, it's free. And they will then invest in usually about 10 or 15. You can see winter 2023. Here's the current batch. And so this program is slightly different from the other programs in that they're already expecting when you go to them that you have some type of team, you have a co-founder, that you have some type of tech, you have some type of prototype. It's not just an idea. You may or may not be generating revenue. That is something that really depends upon your industry. But generally speaking, you're a little bit further along, but maybe you're not ready to go and raise from VCs yet. So Iterative and these type of incubators are generally new to Singapore. And again, it's a very good starting point if you're new to fundraising, right? So now I'm going to go to the VC path, starting from what I had mentioned earlier, which is pre-seed. So pre-seed VCs, who are pre-seed VCs in Singapore? So, and what is a pre-seed VC? So one of the pre-seed VCs in Singapore is called Orville Ventures. Orville Ventures might invest in you similar to what we talked about earlier with the Ascend group, and they're related to Ascend. It's the same people, anywhere from, let's say, 50,000 to maybe 250,000 US dollars. And obviously they will get some equity in exchange for that, but it's a negotiable number. It's not fixed like the incubator. And so that's a key distinction when we're thinking about the iterative type programs versus a pre-seed fund. A pre-seed fund invests any time of the year. There's no limit on how many they group together. And generally speaking, a lot of them invest in a wider range of companies than maybe the incubator like an Iterative will do. So you'll see, for instance, our company Pollen here, as we introduced, does liquidation. Some other companies like Stitch, you could say somewhat related, but then they have companies that are in real estate. They have companies that are doing blockchain, completely different industries, not related to pollen. So why you would want to work with a pre-seed fund is really because you feel like maybe you have enough traction meaning revenue or usage of your product. And maybe you feel like you don't want to be grouped together in such a structured program like either the Antler or the iterative programs I mentioned. So when you're thinking about pre-seed seed, typically these are more passive investors. So a passive investor is usually someone who will give you the cash you need to grow your business, but essentially they are more like there to support you when you need help. They're not going to be scheduling workshops, and they're not going to be visiting your office and giving you the direct hands-on support that you might get from either the angels or, let's say, one of the incubators. So that's very important for you to keep in mind, whether you're looking for additional support or not. So if you're very fortunate and you've raised, let's say, pre-seed funding, right, through some combination of incubator, angel, or going direct to a fund like Orville, another one that we recommend that we also work with in Singapore, Hustle Fund, very similar program to Orville. This is a bit more global though. So again, one of the benefits in Singapore is all of these examples I've given you today are not the exclusive examples. You have several options to choose from. So now let's talk about later stage investment. So when I got funded here, this raised 700,000 about 10 years ago in 2014 in Singapore, there were literally around 5 or 6 different options I could go to. So there weren't many companies to choose from where I could raise funding. And so if the options are limited, and let me just, since I didn't add them here, this was the Wavemaker Ventures was one of the groups. Okay, site, sorry, it's not loading here, but here it is. Wavemaker Ventures was one of the groups, but another one was called Golden Gate. And literally these 5 or 6 funds had a monopoly in what we would call seed or early stage investment. Because again, everything I just mentioned didn't exist 10 years ago. So we are really starting, you know, we had this lecture, let's say 10 years ago, we would be starting here at Golden Gate. I wouldn't have anything earlier to share. And what is the difference between a typical seed stage fund like a Golden Gate or a Wavemaker versus what we had just talked about? The major difference is here, the bar is much higher in terms of traction, in terms of revenue, in terms of your team. And you're going to have to go through a much more formal type of fundraising process. So the typical process is that you would get introduced to either directly through one of the partners or maybe what's called an associate. And you can see here they have different team members. So the best way that this would happen for you is that you would know someone already in Singapore, maybe myself. I know maybe Jeffrey, and you would ask me if I could introduce you to Jeffrey for the reason of potentially raising funds for your company, right? And that would be the best way to get introduced. What would happen is Jeffrey would then either assign one of his colleagues, because he's one of the founding partners, or often called the general partner. That means he is one of the key decision makers, or he would then refer you to maybe someone more relevant on his team who maybe understands your business better. You would then go through 1 or 2 meetings, and if you are successful in those meetings, they would invite you to what's called an IC, or a final pitch, it's also referred to. And this is very common, not just in Singapore, but this also is standard in the Bay Area, where I came from. So, you know, this is really how VC capital works globally. And if you are successful in the IC, which stands the investment committee, then they would issue you what's called a term sheet. And in the term sheet, it would stipulate how much money they're going to invest in your company for how much equity, with a bunch of other terms, which we can't cover today. And if you agree to the term sheet, you would then hire lawyers, and you would actually finalize the final investment documents, right? And then they would invest in your company. So that seems like a complicated process. It is. It takes a lot more time. This could take in Singapore anywhere from, let's say, 4 to 6 weeks. That would be considered very fast, to raise funding from a fund like Golden Gate or Wavemaker to as long as maybe 3 to 6 months. That would be considered maybe more of a median average, right? So it really depends on where you're entering them. But certainly one of the advantages is they're larger funds, they can invest more money. So at a seed stage in Singapore, we're typically seeing investments anywhere from $500,000 to $2 million per fund. So, you know, some companies now you might read from the E27 site, for instance, and you say, oh, someone just raised seed funding, $5-6 million in Singapore. How did they do that? Well, they did that because they got people like Golden Gate, Wavemaker, or other VCs in Singapore and the region, each to commit 500,000 to 2 million. And that's how they got 6 million raised in that stage of their company. So finally, I'm going to end, and I wanted to make sure we have plenty of time for any questions so I can go deeper to what you guys actually want me to talk about. But I'm going to wrap up now with, you know, what would be later stage investment opportunities in Singapore. So certainly, the later stage you are, meaning the more revenue you're generating, the more money you can raise from investment companies, one of which is like Jungle. So the way you can evaluate a VC in Singapore or any other market is you need to see how big their fund is, right? How much money have they raised to invest in companies like yours? And if the fund has raised at least 500 million US dollars, which companies like Jungle have, Wavemaker has, then they're considered a later stage fund, which means they can invest in what's called Series A or maybe even Series B. So Series A is really the same as seed. It just means that you have more traction, more revenue, more team members, and maybe they feel like therefore you're deserving a bigger check, a bigger investment amount. So instead of maybe 500,000 to 2 million for your startup in Singapore, here you could be raising maybe 2 to 5 million in Series A and maybe 5 to 10 million in Series B. And these type of companies typically want to be the first check, which means they want to lead the round. And then afterwards, you can find other investors, maybe like a Golden Gate, could then join them, or other people could join them. And as we showed you from E27, we have 1,000 different VCs to group together. So if Jungle was going to be doing your investment, then you would most likely be adding another 1 or 2, working with them together. So it's a very similar process. When we first were looking into the market 10 years ago, really what we saw for later stage funds in the $500 million size was really government-backed funds, so sovereign funds. And in Singapore, you have Temasek, which is a sovereign wealth fund, and they started their own VC called Vertex. So Vertex, if you go to their site, they'll say, oh, we invest in early stage. That's great, they do. But really, because they have government funding, they look for much later stage companies typically. So usually that is a Series A, Series B, or even Series C and beyond. So for these type of funds, for most of you, it's not going to be that useful. But the advantage is, as we've just showed, all the way from when you just have an idea and you're looking to get a co-founder, from A to Z, you have an entry point here. Whereas before, it was really your entry point was towards the end stages here. So what I've seen personally, now to stop the presentation and see if there's any questions, is that we've really seen the most development in the early stage. That startup.sg site that was shared earlier really was created because now you have so many first-time founders, people who have never done a tech startup, who now want to either start their own startup, or as I mentioned also, you have a lot of people looking to invest in startups for the first time. So that website by the government of Singapore is really a great way to navigate and get those resources. But ultimately, I believe that if you're serious about this, the best place to get started is not through the government side, but it's really going to find one of those entry points and someone who's already living and working in Singapore who can help you navigate for your unique use case what you want to achieve, whether you're looking to raise funding from in a company that already exists, you want to start a new company, you want to join a company, maybe you want to invest in a company. Those are all great options, but have very different options to consider. So with that said, maybe I'll pause and see if there's any questions or any other areas of interest.
Audience, please raise your hand if you have any questions. You can we're gonna unmute you. Also, you can type on in chat box if you have any questions. Do you have any questions?
Thank you very much. It's very educational. Can I ask a question? So my question is, there seems to be a lot of terminologies on this works. So for someone who are completely new to this, so is it enough to just go look at this website to figure out all this terminology? Or do you think that they should go study maybe something related, like maybe a business degree or even an MBA or something? Do you think that going to this kind of degree helps a lot?
I'm a bit biased, but personally speaking, I don't see a lot of value by studying or going through the academic path and getting an MBA. Generally speaking, meaning if you're looking to either invest in a company or as an angel investor, or maybe you're looking to raise funding and do your own company, I think it's really one of these opportunities where you have to do it yourself, right? You have to roll up your sleeves a bit and really meet people. And if you're in the classroom, it's great. You learn about the theory, you get the terminology, but what you're not going to get, unfortunately, is you're not going to meet people. So I didn't talk about other programs that sometimes people think about for Singapore, like the INSEAD program, right? Which is quite a well-known MBA program. And I know that the Nagoya University recently has started discussion to work with NUS, our university here, right? And entrepreneurship and exchange and these type of webinars are a great way to talk about the theory, to learn about the terminology. But it's not necessarily a great place, unfortunately, to meet these type of people that can really, I think, make an impact in whatever you're trying to achieve. So I would say if you can, the best way would be, rather than spending that money on going through the program, at least spend like a month or so, come to Singapore, right? Meet people, attend some startup conferences, and see if this is something that you really want to commit to. And maybe after that time, if you determine, this is too overwhelming, I actually want to take a step back, learn the theory, I want to get some mentorship in a more of a classroom structured environment, certainly those programs would be great for you. I just feel that if you've already made up your mind that you wanted to be an entrepreneur and do a startup, they become a luxury, but it's not a necessity. So I never say that you must do it. But then again, if people say that they want to, everyone is different. And certainly many people have gone through those programs and become very successful. So I don't necessarily discourage people from not taking an MBA or going to INSEAD in Singapore and learning about the terms and entrepreneurship. It's just that I say that you don't have to.
Thank you.
I still have another question. So my question is, for somebody who is got a newly graduate students, usually I think they find it very overwhelming to get this kind of information. And at the same time, maybe they think that they might want to actually look for a job first. So what kind of job they can look for if they want to consider to be maybe to do a startup later on? Is it relevant, or should they just go ahead and just look for investors already?
Well, I mean, the classic and most famous examples, I'm sure the people here joining are aware of, is Mark Zuckerberg, right? When he was at Harvard University and just did Facebook, right? So certainly, if you are, I would say, more skewing on the technical side of things and you have an amazing idea, right? Something with generative AI, or maybe you're doing blockchain, or you're just doing something that is going to really improve people's lives and you can get it out there. By all means, just go straight from university and do your startup. However, I think if you don't feel comfortable doing that, or maybe you don't want to do that, or you can't do that, yes, joining a startup is a great way to get the practical experience. Maybe you learn terminology, but you don't necessarily have to invest the time and capital to join an MBA program. So how do you find a startup to join? Maybe that should be the next question then if you go down that path. Well, certainly for anyone who's on this call, happy to discuss that with you. Poland is always hiring. So we actually are looking for people in Nagoya to help us with our Japan business. But there's many other companies, I think, similar to that, who are part of the Pre-Station AI, which we're a member of in Nagoya. But there's also a lot of companies hiring in Tokyo. And of course, there's many companies hiring in Singapore. So really, I think now with so many companies working on Slack and remote, it doesn't necessarily matter, frankly, where you are based. It's more important, I think, in terms of what you want to do and what you want to learn. So I typically break it up into two categories. There are people who want to be on the tech, product, engineering side of things, and there are people who want to be on the business side of things. And I think you probably know where you are on that spectrum. If you don't, I'm not sure I'm the best person to advise you, but probably that would be my first recommendation is before you go job hunting, you kind of need to know from what you enjoy just in the classroom, right? Do you find yourself more thinking about the big picture, strategy, monetization, business, marketing, sales, or do you think more about the internal side of things and how you want to build something or how you want to design something, right? Or architect something. And then maybe you're skewing more on the technical side of things. Because why I always say that's important is because that will determine the type of business that you should probably look to join. Startups tend to be focused either on one of those two things more aggressively than the other. So what do I mean by that? If let's say you were on the business side, one of the better places probably for you to think about, frankly, would be an e-commerce site or website online that's selling some physical product, or a marketplace like a Rakuten or a competitor to them, or an Amazon. And why I say that is because one of the most important things that those companies have to do is they need to sell their products online. And a big part of that is through marketing and sales. So if you're able to do marketing and sales, then you would get a lot of hands-on experience with those type of companies. If, however, you're looking to do more on the technical side of things, then probably working with more of an, let's say, an AI company, a B2B company like Pollen, maybe those would be better companies for you because there's more of an emphasis on data and on building something for other businesses or other people. So I think that's where you can get started. And then obviously use the resources we talked about, like a website directory of startups who are hiring, or go to LinkedIn. Those are great resources to join. And I think generally speaking, that's something that as a fresh grad, you should always consider before you jump and do your own thing.
Can you hear?
Yes.
Sorry, maybe the problem of our laptop. I think it's.
I'm sorry, we're having some technical issues.
Sorry.
Okay.
So could you like we couldn't able to hear the last what you were, sorry.
So I just said that I think it's important that yes, a fresh grad student, they do consider maybe joining an existing company if they don't feel comfortable in doing a company on their own. That's usually a good course of action. And the suggestion I said was then to choose whether you're more inclined to be on the technical side or you're more inclined to be on the business side, because that will then determine what type of company maybe is best for you to consider joining, whether it's at an intern or maybe an entry-level position.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can I ask also, like when you moved to, like, you studied in the US, right? Then like you just the US, and you said like market in US and China is such kind of saturated. That's why you went back your home to Singapore. But like now it's kind of for me, like I felt like Singapore market is now kind of saturated.
Yes.
So like, would you recommend like young Singaporean like her or like a Japanese young entrepreneur from Japan like who want to start a business? Do you recommend them to go to Singapore? I learned today also like there are many services in Singapore is available. Like there I know there's pro and cons. Like could you like say something?
Yes. So I recently spent 5 weeks in Japan earlier this year, and I was in Aichi. I met companies there. I also went to Tokyo, obviously, and went to Osaka. And it's very interesting in each one of these areas. You have startup hubs, right, where people gather together, exchange ideas, try to matchmake between companies that want to work together or raise funding. It's very exciting to see that in Japan, right? But to be honest, it's only a fraction of what you would find here in Singapore, right? Like those type of activities are great, but they're still not enough in my opinion. And that's because I'm comparing it to the largest market, which is Silicon Valley in the US, and then an emerging market like Singapore, which I do agree is becoming much more saturated. But there's a reason why these markets are like that way, right? It's because there's a heavy concentration of talent, and with talent, you can build great businesses, right? Or you can join a great business. So I think that if you are very serious about the industry, you can't shy away from joining a competitive market. But at the same time, if you feel like maybe you stand a better chance in a market like Japan, and maybe you're more comfortable with doing your business in Japan, then whether you're Singaporean or whether you're Japanese or from some other country, by all means, I think you should do that, even though maybe you feel like it doesn't have the same support. I think it's more important that you optimize for what you are trying to do individually than follow a market trend, if that makes sense. So for me, frankly, the only reason I went to Singapore after Silicon Valley was I already had family. I was born in Singapore. So it wasn't a foreign country, number one. Number two, I had some colleagues in Singapore, right, who we were working with remotely. So they were able to explain to me and tell me about E27, right, and tell me about maybe other people that we could work with. And three, I knew that it was a market that was starting to pick up. So for instance, there's a big difference between 2012, 2014, and now 2023, and then next year, 2024. But if you think about, let's say, 2004 versus 2014, that is a bigger gap in terms of the options you had for startup. And I was in Singapore in 2004, and I actually was in the film industry, believe it or not. I was selling, yes, I was selling sponsorship for a company called Shaw Brothers. So I wasn't in the tech industry. I was in a different industry. And that's just because there really wasn't a tech industry, in all honesty, in 2004 in Singapore. So, you know, I think that in Japan, you can say that there is a tech industry. So I would recommend that, you know, my original advice still stands. I think you should spend one week, 1 month, if you can, come to Singapore, get familiar with the culture, network, go back to Japan if that's where you're currently based, and see which market makes sense for you, because certain people will find maybe less pressure. An environment like Japan could be considered more friendly, right? Because it's a smaller community, less events, everyone knows each other maybe more. It is maybe an easier way for you to stand out, and maybe you can work at a more gradual pace. If you come to Singapore, it's the exact opposite. You'll have many more opportunities, but you'll find that the expectation and the speed you need to advance is much faster, right? You need to find a co-founder much faster. You need to raise funding much faster. You need to, maybe if you're looking to even to invest, you need to like make investment decisions much faster, because there's more competition for finding companies in Singapore than Japan. So these are really considerations that I think would need to be addressed on more of an individual level, but both are good options. And I would encourage people to consider both options.
Thank you very much. You have more questions?
Audience
Questions? Yeah.
Maybe audience is asleep, maybe. My presentation, I'm sorry if not exciting.
Not at all, but like we in Tongali, we plan we started after the COVID, we started to go to Singapore. Last year, we we took 20 students to to visit NUS and do some entrepreneurship learning programs. So many students are first time in different after COVID, students couldn't go to other countries. Then this last year was the first time we start doing to overseas learning program. Then but Singapore is such a small community, right? So and but I felt I think students all felt it's very fast.
Yes. The speed is much faster here, not like Shinkansen speed, but like the business speed of decision making and planning and raising funds or investing. Everything is faster than Japan here.
But I didn't felt the same way when I visited the States. But I felt much faster in Singapore. People are much busy.
Yeah. So let me compare for a minute the US maybe to Singapore, so I can put Singapore in a different context. Because previously I'm talking Japan versus Singapore. But what about Singapore versus US, right? Because maybe your students are more familiar, right, with the Mark Zuckerberg, the Facebook, all the famous companies, right? So and I'm from there, so I think I have a little bit of knowledge, although I've been 10 years now in Singapore, so my knowledge is already outdated. But in my opinion, again, one of the biggest, there's two big advantages that Silicon Valley and the US have over, let's say, Singapore and other countries with a lot of startup and tech. The first advantage is, again, the speed. So Singapore is faster than Japan, but US is way faster than Singapore. So what do I mean by this speed? When I raised venture capital funding for the first time in San Francisco, from the entire process, from meeting the investor to getting the money in the bank, took around 1 week from start to finish. 1 week. As I explained to you here, maybe if you get lucky, you can get start to finish maybe in 1 month, right? Which is considered very fast. This is very fast, right? I think even if you ask your mother or father for money in Singapore, it might take longer than 1 week.
Sometimes the money doesn't come.
Oh, it never will come. Yes, it'll never come. That might be a Singaporean thing, though. So I think that the speed factor cannot be matched, right? But again, there's a cost of speed, and the cost of speed is you start to get that saturation because everyone wants to take advantage, and then everyone moves, and then suddenly it's very hard to actually access, right? And it becomes very competitive. Whatever thing you're working on, there's going to be so much more competition, right? So that's a negative of having too fast speed, is the saturation. The second thing is really talent. So the biggest thing I see from the US versus Singapore is that Singapore is great to hire because in the sense that we get the best of Southeast Asia. If you think about our talent pool, I think it was announced earlier, right? We have a great kind of wealth of foreign talent. And this foreign talent comes from all walks of life, from all countries, all languages, all races, all genders, right? There's great female, I have a female co-founder. So there's many different people here that you can do business with in Singapore, but it's still a small island, right? The red dot. You know, San Jose, Silicon Valley, you know, that whole area like Sunnyvale, Cupertino, very famous companies like Apple, Google, right, and Mountain View are all based there. It's not geographically a huge space, but the talent that is concentrated there, right, the density of the talent from all of these different places and is unparalleled. And so I think that the other major advantage is that there is a ceiling in terms of the type of talent you can hire in Singapore, right? Even now in 2023, if you wanted to get, let's say, the best data scientists in the world, you might get lucky and maybe you'll find someone who is in Singapore or maybe will move to Singapore, but more often than not, they're not going to be here. They're probably going to be in a larger market like the US, or maybe they're in China, or maybe they're in Europe, or maybe they're in Japan. Japan has very great data scientists, but these are just bigger markets, right? Singapore, just because of the nature of it, has a very limited capacity to take on foreign talent, but that there are caps. So unfortunately, not everyone who wants to be here can be here, and it makes hiring and it makes working somewhat challenging versus a larger market like the US or one of those other ones I mentioned. So I think that access to talent is always going to be something that you might need to keep in the back of your mind if you're doing a business in Singapore, which is why if for Pollen, right, our team has had to hire outside Singapore. So we have people in the country, but we've had to hire people in the region, such as Malaysia and Indonesia and now India. So I think that's also something you need to keep in mind, that if you're doing business in Singapore, you're really doing business in Southeast Asia, because you're not going to be able really to rely on just hiring from here alone. And probably your market, your business is going to be too small to only focus on Singapore as well. So that's also something to keep in mind, right? Versus the US, which is big enough to do business there. Japan, you can do business only in Japan. So are you looking to do a global business, or are you looking to do just a local business? If you're looking to do just a local business, then Singapore definitely is at a disadvantage just because of the size.
Thank you.
Thank you
And
very much.
could you let me know, like, what's your future plan? Are you going to stay in Singapore? And
Future plans, I see us doing a lot more business in the region. So Singapore to India is a big thing we're working on right now. Singapore and Japan. That's how I'm familiar with the Nagoya and the NUS program I mentioned.
Yes.
I think is an amazing opportunity, and Aichi, I think, is very well positioned. So very excited about that. And the other thing I think I'm really thinking about is now that Singapore is getting to the point where you have saturation, it's getting taken seriously by people in the US. So now I'm thinking maybe there's ways to bridge what's happening in the US in our industry with what's happening here in Asia. Those are something that I'll be thinking about maybe towards the end of the year, and especially next year as the markets mature, just because again, having too much of a focus in one small country, I think puts you at too much risk. So hopefully I'll be able to travel and make many more trips to IT in the future. That's my hope.
Great. Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope this has been helpful for everyone.
Thank you very much. You have any?
No,
No?
thank you. I learned a lot today.
Yes.
This is all this stuff I don't learn in my degree at all. And my previous diploma is in business, so I also don't learn about like startups or entrepreneurship. As I agree what you say, actually, a lot of times in the classroom, it's very theoretical. But I think when it comes to really doing business, especially if you want to do a startup, you really need to be very hands-on and go out to network and meet people.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you. We're gonna close.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.